The parable of Jesus that we read this morning from the Gospel of Luke is one that has actually troubled readers a great deal down through the centuries. I mean, how many people have read this parable, put it down and said, what's going on here? I mean, why is Jesus praising this manager who starts out being merely incompetent at his job and then goes on to basically swindle his master on behalf of his master's clients by forgiving their debts? It's not only strange to think that Jesus might have praised such a man for doing such a thing, but it also says the master himself, the guy who was swindled, praised him too. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. I mean, who does that? Who praises a robber for robbing them shrewdly? And I think maybe what might be going on here is that the author of the gospel is actually having about as much trouble with this parable as we do. He tries, as he often does throughout his gospel, to sum up the parable by giving a kind of moralistic lesson. So basically, after telling this parable, he throws out a bunch of morals to this strange story that maybe sound pious, but don't actually make much sense. And he finally ends it all by saying, if then you have not been faithful with dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true wishes? I mean, what does that even mean? So I'll tell you, what I think has happened is this. Luke, the author of this gospel, received this parable. It was handed down to him by early Christian tradition. He was certain that Jesus must have told it. And so he felt he had to include it in his gospel, but I don't think he actually got it. Possibly because he didn't adequately understand the cultural context in which Jesus had told the parable. And if that's what happened, well, then we have a real problem, right? Because we're even further removed from that context than the author of the gospel. What hope do we have of making sense of this rather disturbing story? Well, actually, I think recent events have brought us a little bit closer to the ancient cultural context in which this story was told. And actually, if we play around with Jesus' story a little bit, we might actually find that it makes more sense than we originally thought. I mean, what if Jesus told the parable with some modern characters that we could actually relate to? What if he told it like this? Once upon a time, there was a powerful and wealthy country that decided to hire a manager to take care of all of their affairs. You know, a chief executive. You might want to call him a president. And so they chose someone. But they didn't choose him because they loved all of his policies or his past work history. In fact, there was a few issues with those things. No, it was just they chose him because he seemed like the better option than the guy who had held the office before. So, they decided to give him a chance. But this president's time in office was kind of rocky, almost from the start. And a year or maybe a year and a half into his tenure, many people were beginning to feel as if their affairs as a nation were being mismanaged. Now, I won't tell you all of the ways in which things were going wrong. I'll just, throw out a few examples. Inflation was out of control. Businesses were unable to find workers. Deadly viruses continued to spread, death and sickness. Forest fires raged. Hurricanes threatened, that kind of stuff. And so the polls in the nation put the president on notice that he was bound to lose power. People would overwhelmingly vote for his opponents in the upcoming midterm elections. And things were certainly not looking good for his re-election further down the road. And when the president saw all of these things, well, he said to himself, "What do I do now? The country is taking my position and power away from me. I'm getting a bit old, Jack. I'm no longer strong enough to dig ditches. I don't have the voice or the elocution that's good enough to make money, narrating documentaries on Netflix. What will I do?" And so this is what I've decided to do, he said to himself. I'm going to make people love me. I'm going to make people welcome me back into their homes and their hearts even when I'm done. And so this is what he began to do. One by one, he called in people in the country who had gone to school and who had large debts that they owed as a result. And so one woman came in, and she told them her story. "I went to school to get a professional degree," she said. In order to do that, I needed to borrow money. $30,000 I borrowed. Well, today, thanks to the wonders of compounding interest, I owe $120,000 because of compound interest and income-based repayment that drove the principal higher and higher even when I never missed a payment. And I have paid quite a bit over the years, but none of it has ever decreased the balance. I'm a hardworking professional. I have been all my adult life. The government has collected more in taxes, which I paid cheerfully, to cover the cost of my education. And still I owe 4 times as much as I originally borrowed. I was 17 years old when I entered the student loan program as a college freshman. I had no experience with borrowing. I thought I was doing the right thing, attending college in order to lift myself out of generational poverty, but instead I am further in debt than ever, and my only way out is through death or permanent disability. Another student came in and told the president a story in terms of very simple, succinct number. My original debt when I first graduated was $25,170.50. In the 21 years since I graduated, I repaid $45,650.19. Today, thanks to the wonders of compound interest, I still owe $34,713 on that same loan. And so the stories went, and they went on and on. Numbers varied, of course. Some were large, some were relatively small, but in many cases, the debts that people carried had a huge negative impact on their lives. And so this is what the president did. He went back to the first person and said, Here, take your account, and where it says that you owe $120,000, write down $60,000 instead. And to the second person he said, where it says that you owe $35,000, write down $25,000 instead. And so he went from one debtor to the next, providing relief. That was maybe not huge, maybe not sufficient in every case, but it did at least make a difference in every person's life. And what do you suppose the reaction was when the president did all of this? Well, unsurprisingly, perhaps the reactions were mixed. Some said it was not enough, that it was too little, to help some of the worst cases, the people who needed it most. And there were others who complained that even to offer such forgiveness was unfair, unjust to those who in previous times had managed to pay off their own debts through hard work. But there were some for whom all of this began to change their perspective on what had seemed to be a failed presidency. And some began to praise the president, or at the very least to admit that he was maybe more shrewd as a politician than they had given him credit for. Now, I assume that many of you have followed, to a certain extent, the discussion about forgiveness of student debts that's been taking place in the United States. I mean, it's been all over the news, and it does connect with some similar issues here in Canada. I wanted to tell you this story, and especially to highlight some of these recent developments over this issue for a particular reason. And it's not really because I want to make any political point or endorse a specific political position. I do have personal political beliefs about the forgiveness of student debts, but no, I'm not here to push those. I just wanted to bring it up because it really seems like an issue that everybody has opinions on, and they have wildly different opinions. There are some who declare that the forgiveness of such debts is terrible, is unjust, and there are others who say the same thing about the debts themselves. And it's not surprising that people feel so strongly, because honestly, we're talking about a load of debt here that collectively is so large that it affects the entire economy. I mean, student debt is connected to the inflation crisis, to the housing crisis, to the employment crisis. It affects us all. All of these things affect us all. So when you hear me tell a story about a president forgiving debts to students in this present context, guess what? Everyone knows exactly what I'm talking about. Not only that, but they also have very strong opinions, understandably. And I wanted you to understand that when Jesus told his story of a manager who was forgiving debts owed to his master, the reaction actually would have been almost exactly the same. Everyone would have known immediately what Jesus was talking about. And they would have had strong and various opinions. Because Jesus told his story in a very similar situation. You see, Galilee in Jesus' day was in a debt crisis. It wasn't a student debt crisis. It was spread through all of society. People everywhere were being crushed by their debts. They were losing family homesteads, being pushed into homelessness, begging, marginal labor, and often slavery. But all of this was also complicated in Jesus' day because, according to the ancient laws of Israel, debt itself was actually illegal. The laws of Moses were quite clear. Lending at interest was simply not permitted. And yet, in Palestine in Roman times, it was everywhere. So how could that be? Well, it's basically this. When money is involved, people can get infinitely creative. Here's what they did. When somebody was in a desperate state and needed to borrow, say, 30 bushels of wheat, here's what they would do. They would go to the rich people and beg for help. And the wealthy people did want to help, but also, as is kind of typical, they wanted to know what was in it for them. Yeah, they wanted some interest for their trouble. But the law said they couldn't legally demand interest. So here's what would happen. When the manager wrote down the debt, he wouldn't write down, I owe the master 80 bushels plus 25% interest. No, that was illegal. You couldn't write that, right? So here's what happened. Instead, the manager would write down, I owe 100 bushels, even though the poor person only got 80. There was no mention of interest, no paper trail. So nobody broke the law, right? Only the manager and the master and the debtor knew what had really gone on. Except, of course, everyone suspected, everyone pretty much knew exactly what was going on and how it worked. It was just that they couldn't prove it. There was no paperwork. But Jesus told this parable to illustrate actually what were the vulnerabilities of the rich in such a system. You see, the managers, they had all the dirt they needed to bring down their wealthy masters. And when the manager falls out with his master, all he has to do is go around to all the people who owe the master things and rewrite the records of what they owe. I mean, everyone would have understood when they heard this parable that that was what was going on. The manager wasn't robbing the master of anything but the illegal interest he had charged. And guess what the best part was? The master couldn't do a thing about it, because if he were to punish the crooked manager, he would have to admit that he had been charging interest. That was illegal. So he had no choice. He actually had to praise the crooked manager. Oh, and I could almost imagine the press conference. Yes, I'd like to thank my blessed manager for uncovering the egregious and totally unintentional errors in my financial records and correcting the amounts that people owed me. I don't know what happened, but I'm glad he fixed it, and I will be eternally grateful to my manager. Everyone who was listening to Jesus tell this parable understood exactly what he was talking about. They understood that it was all about forgiving interest on debts, and they understood exactly how that shrewd manager managed to get away with it. So why did Jesus tell this story? Was he trying to press people to take a particular position on the forgiveness of debts and the good that it could do? Maybe, possibly. But he may have also just been trying to tap into all of the conflicting thoughts and ideas and opinions on debt that were swirling around in society at that time. Jesus told these parables, above all, to be provocative, to make people think about the things they'd been trying to avoid thinking about. And that's why I think that maybe what Jesus is looking for us to do as we read this parable today, and not necessarily to embrace a specific party's policy on the issue of debt, but he is asking us to think and think creatively about debt and the harm that it does to people who carry it. He wants us to think creatively what we can do about these burdens and the harms that they cause. He's pushing us to think about the things we don't really want to dwell on because they matter. Because Jesus cares about everyone's life, and in particular cares about those who are struggling. Lord our God, There is a lot of damage being done in our society because of debt. And yeah, wonderful profits are being made. But people are being pushed into untenable positions. Help us by your grace to think creatively about what we can do about these issues to build a better world for everyone. Amen.